All right. Great. Well, hello, everybody. Hello, people in the room. Here we've got a small group here at Fintry and a lot of people joining us online. So it's lovely that you can join us virtually. So I'll try and talk in both directions, but that might mean I'm not looking at you at the right moment. Anyway. Okay, so we are just a few days away from the autumnal equinox. And those of us here at Fintry have kind of gathered to think about that. So what I'm going to do this evening is to think about the equinox and its history and its meaning in connection with Tolkien's fiction and his mythology and the ways that he kind of incorporated this special time of year into his writing. Quite a lot of Tolkien's writing has a rather autumnal air to it. He wrote really beautifully about autumn landscapes. He also painted them beautifully. These are his paintings you can see on the slide. He really liked autumn trees and things like that. But the equinox is, of course, also a moment in the year that has a very long history in folklore and legend and mythology. And some of that influences the way that Tolkien wrote about it. So I'll kind of be thinking about both of those things this evening. So I'm going to start by reading the poem from which I took the title of this talk. This is the point at which the slides I'm not going to turn. All right, we might just have to wait a moment for the PowerPoint to catch up. I did this before and then it started to work. So there we go. Okay, so this is The Voyage of Earendel, the Evening Star. And this is a poem that Tolkien wrote on the 24th of September, 1914. So that's exactly 111 years ago next week. And that's 111 years ago, for those of you who know The Hobbit. Yeah, okay, that's good. There's a significant number. And at the time he wrote this, Tolkien was 22 years old. He was still a student at Oxford, and he was spending the last weeks of his summer vacation staying with family in Nottinghamshire. And at the time of the equinox, he wrote this poem. Earendel sprang up from the ocean's cup in the gloom of the mid-world's rim. From the door of night, as a ray of light leapt over the twilight brim, and launching his bark like a silver spark from the golden fading sand, down the sunlit breath of day's fiery death, he sped from Westerland. He threaded his path o'er the aftermath of the glory of the sun, and went wandering far past many a star in his gleaming galleon. On the gathering tide of darkness ride the argosies of the sky, and spangle the night with their sails of light as the evening star goes by. But unheeding he dips past these twinkling ships by his wandering spirit whirled on a magic quest through the darkling west toward the margent of the world. And he fares in haste o'er the jeweled waste to the dusk from whence he came, with his heart afire with bright desire and his face in silver flame. For the ship of the moon from the east comes soon from the haven of the sun, whose white gates gleam in the coming beam of the mighty silver one. Lo, with bellying clouds as his vessel shrouds, he weighs anchor down the dark, and on shimmering oars leaves the blazing shores in his argent orbed bark. And Earendel fled from that shipman dread, beyond the dark earth's pale, back under the rim of the ocean dim, and behind the world set sail. And he heard the mirth of the folk of earth, and hearkened to their tears, as the world dropped back in a cloudy wrack on its journey down the years. Then he glimmering passed to the starless vast as an eyelid lamp at sea, and out of the ken of mortal men set his lonely errantry, tracking the sun in his galleon and voyaging the skies, till his splendor was shorn by the birth of morn, and he died with the dawn in his eyes. So if you don't immediately get what this poem is about, that's okay, because when he wrote it, Tolkien didn't know what it was about either. The story is that after he'd written it, he showed it to a friend, and his friend really liked it, but he said, Tolkien, what's it really about? And Tolkien said, I don't know, I'll try to find out. And that process of trying to find out was the beginning of what became a lifelong creative journey. So this poem is in fact about a personification of the evening star as it moves through the sky, rising at sunset, traveling beyond the world, the edge of the world, until it kind of dies by being swallowed up by the dawn. And when Tolkien wrote it, that's all it was, a poem about the evening star. But this poem also marked the very first stage in the development of Tolkien's fictional mythology, that incredibly complex world of imagined myth and legend that decades later would form the backdrop to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So when he wrote this poem, Tolkien hadn't yet begun to create the mythology in which this character, Earendel, would come to play an important part. That was all still away in the future. But this poem was kind of like the first spark of light which kindled the creative fire. So the writing of this poem was a pivotal event for Tolkien, and it came at a moment when he was on the threshold of a great change in his life, because September 1914, of course, was just a month after the start of the First World War. Young Tolkien, he was on the threshold of adult life. He was finishing his degree at Oxford. He was engaged to be married. He was planning to embark on a career as a scholar of medieval literature. And the outbreak of war suddenly changed everything. Soon he would enlist in the army and end up fighting at the Somme. So in September 1914, neither he or anybody else could have foreseen the shadows that would fall across the world over the next few years. But maybe we can see a sense of impending change and gathering darkness in the mood of this poem. So I'm going to come back to Earendel later this evening, so I won't say more about this poem now, but we can kind of take some images from this equinox poem and maybe sort of hold them in mind as we go on. So we have sunset, the last light of the setting sun, and a star rising out of the ocean. A ship traveling through the sky past other ships, which are sort of stars and ships at the same time with gleaming sails of light. A journey to the edge of the world, a journey towards death, a journey into the darkness. Okay, so we're here to think about the autumnal equinox, one of 2 points in the year when the light and dark are equally balanced and days and nights are of equal length. And after the equinox, of course, by this time next week, the balance will have tipped towards the darkness. Nights will grow longer, the days will wane until the winter solstice in December. So in the Northern Hemisphere, this period of the year is very much a time of gathering darkness. I think we can see that right now. And so our own kind of journey into the dark. And before we think about the role of the autumnal equinox in Tolkien's works, I want to look a bit at how this moment in the year has been thought about over time, and especially how it appears in some of the medieval English writings, which Tolkien, obviously as a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, worked most closely with throughout his life. So if you look at a calendar for September in a medieval manuscript, like a Book of Hours or a Psalter, you quite often see an image like this, a figure holding a pair of balance scales. And that's because medieval calendars, along with lots of other kinds of information about, about saints' days and other important days in the year, mark the day of the month on which the sun enters a new sign of the zodiac. And around September the 22nd, of course, the sun enters Libra, the sign of the scales. So that's what these figures primarily represent, Libra. But because they appear very close to where these calendars also mark the date of the equinox, they take on a kind of additional symbolism too. So they become a visual depiction of this moment of cosmic balance, equilibrium. And we might think of that as a balance between day and night, so two halves of the cycle of 24 hours, but also a balance between the two halves of the year. These symbols appear at the time when we're entering the dark half of the year, the 6 months when the nights are longer than the days. And that's an important moment of transition, isn't it? So today we typically think of the year as having 4 seasons, right? That's kind of our standard assumption. And for a lot of people, September is kind of what they consider the beginning of autumn. So some people think the 1st of September, some people say the equinox, people have different ideas about that. But that wasn't always the case. In the Middle Ages, and certainly in early medieval England, it was also common to divide the year into 2 halves, just 2 seasons, summer and winter, both 6 months long. And the solstices would fall around the middle of each season, which is why the summer solstice is historically known as midsummer and the winter solstice as midwinter, of course. And that made sense in a society where the sense of time was very closely connected to the agricultural calendar, because summer was the 6 months in which plants and crops grow and then come to fruition and then are harvested. So sort of March to September, and winter's really just the other half of the year. the cold time, the dark time, when you have to wait really until food is you can grow food again. So a good harvest was essential for surviving through the winter months, and bringing in the harvest involved a huge amount of work, a lot of people in the community. So it very much shaped what people would be doing around this time of year. And of course, the timing of harvest is something that varies a lot between different regions of the world. I'm conscious of all the Americans and other people here joining us on Zoom. And of course, in other English-speaking countries, they celebrate harvest festivals a bit later in the year than we do, don't we? Like Thanksgiving in November or something. But in Britain, the harvest season traditionally is sort of August, September, has historically been. So that means that the cultural significance of this time around the equinox has changed a lot in the past few centuries, as we've moved away from a very agricultural society in which everybody's lives are kind of connected to harvest, and harvest is a crucial part of life. So today, when we think about autumn and what that season means to us, it might include harvest, but it probably includes lots of other things as well, doesn't it? But that wasn't really the case in the Middle Ages. For a long time, there wasn't even a separate name for the season of autumn. It was just harvest until the late Middle Ages. So if we're thinking about the meaning of the equinox in the kinds of medieval texts that Tolkien knew best, we do very much have to think about it in terms of the end of harvest and this transition from the 6 months of summer into winter, into the dark half of the year. And again, ideas about when those 6 months of summer and winter might begin and end kind of vary a bit between different regions, different cultures. Some of you might be familiar with the Irish or the Gaelic tradition, where the beginning of summer is Beltane, right? So what becomes May Day, and the beginning of winter is Samhain, so Halloween, So that's kind of May, November. But in Anglo-Saxon England, so Tolkien's special interest, the transition was much more closely connected to the equinox. So if we go back to the very earliest description of the medieval English calendar, this is by the Anglo-Saxon historian Bede, he tells us originally the Anglo-Saxons divided the year as a whole into 2 seasons, summer and winter, assigning the 6 months in which the days are longer than the nights to summer and the other 6 to winter. Hence they called the month in which the winter season began Winterfylleth, a name made from winter and full moon, because winter began on the full moon of that month. So what he's describing here is the calendar of the pagan Anglo-Saxons before they converted to Christianity. So before they adopted the Julian calendar and the Roman system of months that we would recognize today, January, February, and so on. Before that, they had their own months, their own structure of the year. And then the months don't exactly line up with ours, because their calendar had a more kind of lunar influence to it. So Winterfylleth was the month sort of equivalent to October, but it might sometimes start in late September, depending on the timing of the first full moon after the autumnal equinox. So as Bede says, that full moon marked the beginning of winter, and winter would then last till the first full moon after the spring equinox, which would be the start of summer. Okay. Winterfylleth, I really like that name. I think it's kind of just a beautiful name. And maybe Tolkien liked it too, because this is a little detail that he borrowed into Middle-earth. So we're going to see throughout this evening that Tolkien put a huge amount of thought into the calendars and seasonal cycles that he created for his fictional worlds, right down to the very, very smallest details. And if you read Appendix D of The Lord of the Rings, not many people do, but it is there, there's incredibly detailed descriptions of the calendars he created for the elves and men and hobbits. And about the hobbits, for the Shire calendar of the hobbits, he borrowed the names of the Anglo-Saxon months that Bede lists, but he slightly adapted them, sometimes in kind of playful ways. So in the Shire, the 10th month is based on Winterfylleth, but actually he makes it Winterfilth. And he says people would joke about Winterfilth in the muddy Shire. And he gives a fictional history for this name within Middle-earth. He says it originally referred to the filling or completion of the year before winter, and descended from times when the Hobbit's new year began after harvest. So here he's reflecting that kind of real life history of the end of harvest as an important moment of transition, marking a new season, and in this case also the beginning of a new year. So that's a kind of quite small example of Tolkien borrowing from a medieval source to shape the calendar of Middle-earth, but it is an indication of how carefully he paid attention to these details. And a more significant example appears in The Hobbit, So here, if you remember, Bilbo and the dwarves, they're on their quest to get their treasure from the Lonely Mountain. And on their journey, Elrond helps them to read some hidden runes on their map. So runes which can only be read by the light of a full moon on Midsummer Eve. And the runes say that the keyhole to the mountain door will be visible on Durin's Day, the first day of the dwarves' new year, which is the first day of the last moon of autumn on the threshold of winter. And Durin's Day is when the last moon of autumn and the sun appear in the sky together. And Tolkien put this around the same time of the year as Winterfylleth, so October, within the lunar month following the autumnal equinox. And that phrase, the threshold of winter, that's quite a nice way to think about the importance of this time of year. We're not in winter yet. It doesn't feel like we're there, but we're kind of at the doorway to it. So again, we can see Tolkien reflecting, adapting older ways of thinking about the cycle of the year for his fictional cultures. And in this case, he makes it quite crucial to the climax of The Hobbit. But if we want to think about how Tolkien used autumn and winter and seasonal patterns in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in some more kind of fundamental ways, the medieval poem, which is probably most influential on his way of doing that, is Gawain and the Green Knight, so 14th century romance. And Tolkien knew this poem really, really well. He translated it, he wrote about it a lot, spent a lot of time thinking about it. And this is a marvelously subtle poem. It's very carefully constructed. It's absolutely full of symbolism, and particularly symbolism connected to the seasons and the cycle of the year. So to give you a little idea of the story, if you don't know it, it starts as King Arthur and his court are celebrating Christmas and New Year. And this mysterious knight, all in green, rides into their court and challenges them to a Christmas game. Is any of the knights brave enough to chop my head off with an axe and then face the same thing in return? So Gawain, who is young and brave and very honourable and wants to show how honourable he is, says, yeah, sure, I'll do it. I'll take it. And he takes the axe and he cuts off the Green Knight's head. And the knight, as you can see in that image, promptly picks it up again and says, okay, great, come and see me in a year and I'll do the same thing to you. So Gawain has promised to do this, so he has to do it, but he has to wait until the following Christmas before he can go and find the Green Knight and kind of fulfill his part of the bargain. So a year passes between the first part of the story and the rest of it. And in the middle, there's a really wonderful, famous poetic description of the passing seasons. So this is Tolkien's own translation of the section which deals with this part of the year. So this transition from harvest into winter. And this is as the time is growing closer for Gawain to set out on his quest. Then harvest hurries in and hardens the crop quickly, warns it before winter to wax to ripeness. He drives with his drought the dust till it rises from the face of the land and flies up aloft. Wild wind in the welkin, that's the sky, makes war on the sun. The leaves loosed from the linden alight on the ground. And all grey is the grass that green was before. All things ripen and rot that rose up at first. And so the year runs away in yesterday's many. Isn't that a great line? And here winter wends again, as by the way of the world it ought, until the Michaelmas moon has winter's boding brought. Sir Gawain then full soon of his grievous journey thought. So this tells us some interesting things about how this medieval poet thought about this moment in the year. Winter, we can see here, comes really soon after the end of the harvest. And this is late September he's talking about, because the poet says the Michaelmas moon brings what Tolkien translates as winter's boding, like kind of warning of winter, the first hint of winter. And Michaelmas is the 29th of September. I'll say more about that later. So the Michaelmas moon would be the full moon closest to that date, probably. So it's quite parallel to the Winterfylleth moon and maybe Durin's Day in The Hobbit, these different ways of thinking about the threshold of winter. But what makes this passage quite interesting for thinking about how Tolkien incorporates the seasons into his fiction is that it is a beautiful description, but it's also very closely connected to the quest that Gawain is going to go on and his sort of literal and metaphorical journey as a character. So he gaily makes this promise on New Year's Day that he'll go and seek the Green Knight and face having his head cut off. But then the year passes and he's got time to remember that he is a human being. So he's not magical. And if someone cuts his head off, he might not be able to pick it up again. So he starts to fear that actually perhaps this is a journey, he might be going to face his death. So the coming of winter also means that his journey is getting closer. this grievous journey, in Tolkien's phrase. And it's not an adventure where he's like, okay, great, I'm going to ride off on this adventure. It's something quite ominous and a sense of a growing gloom or danger that comes with the approach of winter. So soon after this, on All Hallows Day, he sets out on his quest, and then the poem really beautifully recounts his journey through the very bleak winter landscape. It's the borders of Wales, and it's kind of the wildness of that landscape, very cold, very hostile, until he meets the Green Knight on New Year's Day. And what he experiences, I won't spoil the story, so because you should go and read it if you haven't, but what he experiences, it's a very personal kind of trial. It confronts him with his mortality, and also a kind of test to his ideals, his sense of identity as a chivalrous knight. He comes to doubt himself. It's quite a terrifying experience, quite chastening, but he does survive, and he learns from it, and he kind of becomes a better person because of it. So that meeting, the crucial meeting on New Year's Day, is a kind of rebirth for him. He experiences he comes very close to death, but he gets a fresh start, and that's mapped onto the moving from the old year into the new year. So it's a kind of rebirth. So the poem uses the cycle of the seasons to very carefully mirror the psychological and emotional journey that Gawain is going on. And that's really unusual for a quest story like this. You know, most knights in Arthurian romance, they go on their journeys in the summer because that's a good time to travel, right? You don't travel in the winter unless you really have to. So the poet's been really deliberate in setting the quest in winter and kind of exploring that symbolism. So if we turn to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, we can see a very similar kind of care and purpose in the way Tolkien maps the seasonal cycle onto his characters' journeys. Because these are both novels structured around quests, aren't they? That, you know, the there and back again of that kind of classic quest structure, like Gawain, like many medieval romances. And in both novels, Tolkien gives us a huge amount of detail about the seasonal cycle. So if you read it with an eye to that, you'll notice all kinds of details about, you know, how long the daylight is, what the weather's like, what flowers and fruits are growing, all that kind of thing. He's very, very precise about seasonal details, and he writes very attentively about the natural world. And this time of year in September is important in both novels. So in The Hobbit, the story starts at the end of April. That's when Bilbo meets the dwarves and they set out on their quest. So it's May and June in the kind of first, the lighter comic part of the story. By midsummer, they're at Rivendell with the elves. That's the solstice. So it's a very kind of special, numinous time of year. And then the journey progresses through high summer and then early autumn until they reach the Lonely Mountain at the end of their journey at what Tolkien calls the waning of the year. And then we get the Battle of the Five Armies. And then Bilbo takes a very long journey back home. So it's the next June by the time he's back in the Shire. So the whole story takes over a year, but most of the action occurs in summer, so the light half of the year, reaching a climax in the sort of autumn of October and November. And that's kind of appropriate, isn't it, for the tone of The Hobbit, because it's quite a light comic novel altogether. It is a children's book, really, but it does culminate in a more sober sort of mood with the death of some important characters. Bilbo and the dwarves, they do achieve their quest, but a bit like in Gawain and the Green Knight, it's a rather chastening experience. It's not just, oh, easy, happy ending, but a rather, kind of qualified victory. And in The Lord of the Rings, we see the opposite seasonal pattern. So this, of course, is a much more serious, much darker book in lots of ways, and it takes place in the dark half of the year. So in The Hobbit, we mostly get references to months and seasons, but in The Lord of the Rings, we get some really specific dates, days of the month. And on the very first page, we get the date September the 22nd. That's the date of Bilbo's birthday, which is also Frodo's birthday, and the long-expected party, which takes place in the first chapter. That's the 11th birthday, isn't it? And then some years pass, and the ring is now in Frodo's keeping. And Frodo begins to realize he is going to have to undertake a dangerous journey to get it out of the Shire. So as his journey comes closer, there's a kind of a similar mood to that passage in Gawain and the Green Knight, a sense of growing darkness, an inevitable journey which is getting closer as summer gives way to autumn. So when Frodo and his friends leave home with the ring, that's on the 23rd of September. And then the first stages of their journey have some of Tolkien's loveliest writing about autumn. He talks about the harvest plenty of the Shire, the mists, the turning leaves as they're walking through the woodlands, and all with a kind of poignant sense that Frodo is leaving this beauty behind and he doesn't know when he might be coming back again. He's quite consciously taking a journey into the darkness. And as the year darkens, so does the atmosphere of the story. And then the rest of the action takes place between September and the 25th of March, which is the day the ring is destroyed. So effectively all between the autumn equinox and the spring equinox. And that winter setting it's fitting for the mood of the novel, and maybe not just in terms of the kind of dangers that the characters are facing, but also if we think about the fact that for a lot of the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's describing a Middle Earth, which is kind of in the autumn of its life. There's a sense that its best days are over. You know, the characters move through landscapes where there are ruins and memorials to kind of great kings and peoples who've gone. The strength of the elves is waning. You know, the dwarf kingdom of Moria is deserted. So this isn't a springtime world that's full of life and possibility. It's quite an autumnal kind of world in kind of decline, really. But the destruction of the ring does provide a kind of renewal, a new spring. And then after that moment, we do get some happier events linked to dates in summer, like May Day, when Aragorn is crowned king. But again, for Frodo, the end of the quest is not a kind of happy ending. It's not an unqualified triumph. Again, it's something bittersweet, and he can't really live peacefully in the Shire at the end. So in the very last stages of the novel, there's a kind of another autumnal turn. So right at the end of the story, the 1st of September is the date on which he sets out from the Shire for the last time. And then years later, Sam does the same thing close to the same day. So some of these dates are given in the novel itself and some of them only in the appendices. But Tolkien has clearly been really precise in choosing these dates, and he wants us to notice their symbolism. He said himself that the novel begins in autumn and passes through winter to a brilliant spring. And anyone reading the novel is kind of going to be aware of that seasonal pattern, I think, and the atmosphere and the mood that it adds to the story. But to understand what he's doing with these specific dates, we have to go back to thinking about the medieval structure of the year. So at this point, we can go back to Bede. So as well as writing about the Anglo-Saxon calendar, Bede gives us a summary of how the medieval church understood the connection between the solar cycle and the Christian calendar. So not just in Anglo-Saxon England, but across the international medieval church. He says, very many of the church's teachers recount that our Lord was conceived and suffered on the 25th of March at the spring equinox, and that he was born at the winter solstice on the 25th of December. And again, that the Lord's blessed precursor and Baptist was conceived at the autumn equinox on the 24th of September and born at the summer solstice on the 24th of June. To this, they add the explanation that it was fitting that the creator of eternal light should be conceived and born along with the increase of temporal light, and that the herald of penance who must decrease should be engendered and born at a time when the light is waning. So when the Julian calendar was first devised in Rome, these were the dates on which the equinoxes and solstices fell. So they're a little bit later than the dates in our calendar. So like the autumnal equinox, for instance, is not the 21st or 22nd of September, but 24th. And what he is explaining is that early in the history of the church, 4 key festivals were fixed to these 4 quarters of the solar year. So the Feast of the Annunciation and Christmas, marking the conception and birth of Christ. So that's the spring equinox and the winter solstice, and then the conception and birth of John the Baptist at the autumnal equinox and the summer solstice. And it was believed in the Middle Ages that Christ died on the same day he was conceived. So March the 25th was also thought to be the historical date of the crucifixion, although of course Easter actually moves around in different years. So that's why Bede says that Christ was conceived and suffered on March the 25th. And this is all connected to information given in the Bible. So John is one of only 2 saints in Christian tradition to have festivals marking his birth and conception, as well as his death. And that's because the Gospels connect the timing of his birth very closely with that of Christ. Their mothers who were related were pregnant at the same time, so they were born within the same year. And both Christ and John are strongly associated with biblical imagery of light. And as Bede says, the symbolism of these festivals is connected to John's words when he said of Christ, he must increase and I must decrease. So the prophet gives way to the Messiah like the light of the sun increases after the summer solstice and decreases after, sorry, increases after the winter solstice, decreases after the summer solstice. So these festivals became closely associated with the, that powerful symbolism of waxing and waning light over the course of the year. And obviously many religions attach special significance to the solstices and equinoxes. So as Christianity then spread to other parts of Europe in the Middle Ages, this calendar could connect to whatever meaning those dates might kind of already have in other cultures. So for instance, when Christianity reached Anglo-Saxon England, where they were already celebrating solstice festivals at midwinter and midsummer, those took on a new meaning with the coming of these festivals. Christmas merges with an existing midwinter festival like Yule, and midsummer becomes the Nativity of St. John. So over the centuries, the Christian festival and the seasonal significance, they kind of become so closely connected, they're kind of inseparable, really. So for Tolkien, as a devout Catholic and a medieval scholar aware of this history, using these dates in the structure of the Lord of the Rings carries important symbolism, and most of all, March the 25th, the date of Christ's conception and victory over death. That's a really fitting day for the destruction of the ring. So Tolkien would have known these 4 days as religious festivals, but in his time, they also had a wider cultural significance. They were kind of part of daily life for many people in a way that they kind of aren't today, other than Christmas, obviously that's still important. But, and that's because in England, these were linked to the system of quarter days, which were used to divide up the year for practical and administrative purposes. And these were set dates on which people would, they would be used for contracts, for legal agreements, days when you would pay your rent or pay your taxes, or you might make a contract or something. School terms might begin, that kind of thing. So at a time when people didn't mostly use written calendars, it was helpful to have these familiar dates as kind of fixed days for those sorts of purposes. And the system of quarter days originated in the Middle Ages, but it was still used right up into the 20th century. It's only fairly recently that it's fallen out of use. So in Tolkien's day, people would have been very well aware of these dates. Tolkien, for instance, spent most of his career at Oxford, where the autumn term is still called Michaelmas, because that was the autumn day, quarter day, so he knew that. But the autumnal quarter day is a bit unusual because you can see that the others are close to the solstices and equinoxes, at least the dates as given by Bede all those years before. But the autumn quarter day isn't the feast of the conception of John the Baptist, it's Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. And both St. Michael and John the Baptist are useful for thinking about Tolkien's interest in the equinox, because both of them have a really significant, really ancient link to solar and astronomical symbolism and some of the themes that we've already seen associated with this moment in the year. So I'll talk about Michaelmas first, and then we'll finish with John the Baptist. So culturally, Michaelmas has always been a really important festival, certainly in Britain, and it very much marked the point at which the harvest season gave way to preparations for winter. And we saw that already in Gawain and the Green Knight, didn't we, with winter's boding and the Michaelmas moon and so on. And in the Middle Ages, St. Michael, the leader of the archangels, was an incredibly popular saint. He's usually depicted as he is here as a kind of mighty angel slaying a dragon. And he was invoked as a powerful protector against the forces of evil, most especially at the moment of death. So an important aspect of his role, which is maybe not so well known today, is that he was believed to carry the scales of divine justice. He would weigh souls after death and then conduct them to heaven or hell, depending on their merits. So this is how one Anglo-Saxon text describes him. The holy archangel St. Michael, the noble steersman and wise sea captain and most gracious mariner, who sails his ship and fills it with the heavenly dead, that is with holy souls, and with the sail of divine fullness steers it across the waves of the sea, that is across the perils of this world, and conducts the holy souls to the ocean of the heavenly life. So he's a sailor with a heavenly ship, which kind of might remind us of the Earendel poem with which we began this evening. And you can see the scales that he's holding in that image. And in medieval art, he very often is shown either weighing the soul of a person at death or weighing souls at the Last Judgment. So this middle image here is from a medieval wall painting of the Last Judgment. And you can see he's weighing the good deeds of the soul against its bad deeds. And the devil is waiting there to grab the soul if the balance goes the wrong way. And of course, these are Christian versions of archetypes that were found in many ancient religions and mythologies. So he's a psychopomp, he conducts souls to the afterlife. You get that in religions around the world. And the psychostasia, the weighing of souls, seems to have come into Christianity from Egyptian mythology. So St. Michael's scales represent divine justice and equity. But we did see earlier, of course, that in medieval calendars, the scales are linked to this period in September as a symbol of Libra. So the image of the scales is connected to Libra and to the equinox, and also to Michaelmas, this most important festival, in this part of September. So in the autumn of the year, Michaelmas was a yearly reminder of the Day of Judgment, the final reckoning, but also, because it was a quarter day, a reminder of lots of smaller ways of kind of redressing the balance. Quarter days were for settling accounts, for paying your debts, receiving payments, kind of setting things in order before the next quarter of the year. So very much a time of kind of balancing the scales. So just as St. Michael was the soul's protector on its last journey into the darkness of death, so the festival of Michaelmas stood at the door to winter, and it invokes the angelic powers of light as a defense against the growing darkness of the autumn. And we can connect this with another specific date in the Lord of the Rings, because if you look at the chronology in the appendices, you can see that, so Frodo and the Hobbits, they set out on their journey 23rd of September, and then by Michaelmas Eve, that's the day they have their ghostly encounter with the Barrow Wights, and they're rescued by Tom Bombadil. And then the next day, Michaelmas, they meet Aragorn for the first time in Bree. And it seems very fitting that it's on this day that they have, first of all, a dangerous encounter with the spirit world, with evil spirits, and they're rescued by a kind of quasi-angelic figure. I guess we could think of Tom Bombadil in that way. And then they meet Aragorn, who's going to be their guide and their protector on the next stage of their journey. So as their quest grows more dangerous, they meet these figures of strength and protection on their journey into the dark. In Christian tradition, Michael the Archangel is often set in contrast to Satan, Lucifer, the fallen angel who rebelled against God and was cast by St. Michael from heaven into hell. So in a sense, Michael is the anti-Lucifer. He's an archangel who fights for good rather than evil. He's protective, not destructive. He's a messenger and a servant of God rather than a rebel against divine power. And references in the Bible to a fallen angel, a shining one who attempted to rival the brightness of God, have traditionally been identified with the Latin name Lucifer, or the Greek Phosphoros, both names which mean light bearer, light bringer. And these come from Greek and Roman mythology, where they're both names for the morning star. So that's the planet Venus. Venus, the third brightest object in the night sky, is often very visible at dawn or at twilight. So it's sometimes called the morning star or sometimes the evening star. Yeah? And it has this ancient pre-Christian association with Lucifer and Phosphorus, these kind of mythological personifications of this heavenly body. And that finally brings us back to where we started with Tolkien's Earendel, who's also the evening star. Tolkien didn't invent the name Earendel. It's not Elvish, although he incorporated it into his languages. It's an Old English word, which he came across through his study of Anglo-Saxon literature and related languages. And it seems originally to have come from pre-Christian Germanic mythology, but we don't know exactly what its original meaning or significance or legend might have been. There are references to it in these different Germanic languages, which sort of suggest fragments of a story, certainly a strong connection to light, maybe the name of the star, perhaps a hero linked to the sea as well. So, for example, the Old Norse Prose Edda mentions someone called Auvandill, whose frozen toe is thrown up into the sky by Thor and becomes a star. So, as I say, we don't know for sure what the original significance of this name or concept might have been, but this sort of comparison across different Germanic languages was the kind of thing that was very exciting to the young Tolkien and often kind of inspired him to try and kind of put these fragments together and make something out of them. So his 1914 poem about his version of Earendel is in part a kind of a way to construct something out of these fragments about who this light bearer might have been. And particularly important for Tolkien were the ways that the Anglo-Saxon sources use this word. So in Old English, Earendel appears a number of times, but actually only in Christian contexts. And it's used as part of the imagery of light and darkness, which was found in the liturgy of the medieval church. So it means either the first radiance of the sun itself or a star that precedes the dawn. So it can be either of those things, but either way, it's sort of like the first light in the sky in the early morning. So one manuscript of Latin hymns with Old English translations uses Earendel to translate aurora, the dawn, in hymns for the morning. And then in the Blickling homilies, the word Earendel is used as a name for John the Baptist. So as part of that imagery, which we've already seen connecting John and Christ to the cycle of the sun. So this comes from a sermon for the Feast of John's Nativity, so midsummer, summer solstice. And it says, John is like the angels of God. He was the trumpet, Christ's herald in this middle earth, and the messenger of God's son. And now the birth of Christ was at the rising of the new Earendel St. John, and now the light of the true sun, God himself, shall come. So he's called Earendel here because he's the morning star, whose birth is a sign that the sun, Christ, is about to rise, but he's the new Earendel as a replacement for Lucifer, the morning star who fell from heaven. So just like St. Michael is kind of the anti-Lucifer, St. John is here imagined as Lucifer's replacement, a new light bearer who heralds the coming of dawn. And when we remember that Tolkien's poem imagining Earendel as a star and a herald was written on the 24th of September 1914, which is the feast of the conception of John the Baptist, that's too good to be a coincidence, isn't it? That link between John and Earendel must have been part of what Tolkien was thinking about when he was inventing a story for this name. But the most significant use of Earendel for Tolkien's imagination is an Old English poem known as Christ, or the Advent lyrics, but it's inspired by Latin antiphons sung in the days leading up to Christmas. So this is a group of antiphons called the O antiphons, and they're best known today as the hymn O Come Emmanuel. You know that hymn? So, you know, every verse starts with O as an appeal to Christ, O Key of David, and so on. And these antiphons were already sung in the Anglo-Saxon church, and the one that was sung on the winter solstice, so the longest night of the year, was addressed to Christ as the dawn, Oriens. So, you know, in Latin, light appearing in the east. So this antiphon, it prays for the dawn, for the return of light, which is at the same time a kind of an Advent longing for the birth of the Saviour, the Son of Righteousness, but also a very fitting prayer for the winter solstice, asking for the sun's light to be reborn. And an Anglo-Saxon poet inspired by these antiphons used the name Earendel for this light of dawn. Ela Earendel Engla Bechtist, O Earendel, brightest of angels, sent to mankind across Middle-earth, and righteous radiance of the sun, splendid above all stars, by your own self you ever enlighten every age. And when Tolkien came across these lines as a student at Oxford, it seems to have had a very profound effect on him. So much later in his life, he called them rapturous words from which ultimately sprang the whole of my mythology. And in one of his more unusual works, the Notion Club papers, where a group of Oxford dons, a bit like the Inklings, start to have psychic experiences involving journeys across space and time. Those strange experiences are partly prompted by an encounter with this poem in a way that might reflect Tolkien's own kind of feelings about it. So one character says, when he read those words, they produced a curious thrill, as if something had stirred in me, half wakened from sleep. There was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind those words, if I could grasp it, far beyond ancient English. Earendel seems to me a special word. It's not only Anglo-Saxon, but also something much older. So it's almost like a kind of mystical experience, an awakening of psychic powers. And for this character, who is appropriately called Earendel, it prompts a journey into the Anglo-Saxon past, a journey across the Western Ocean to the Isle of the Blessed, which Tolkien connects to his own mythology through the Isle of Numenor, which is kind of his version of Atlantis. And that was a story which had a very profound personal meaning for him. So he's kind of writing about that through this character, Earendel. So throughout his life, Tolkien continued to weave different kinds of myths around the name Earendel. making something new, but also kind of drawing on the Old English texts, which connect Earendel with light, a personification of a star or the dawn, and also with angelic figures who are messengers or intercessors between God and mankind. And we can see sparks of that already in the 1914 poem. And then over time, as he developed his mythology, his Earendel became a character with a story of his own, which is mostly told in the Silmarillion. So I won't get into all the details of it here, it's very complex. But essentially that character, Earendel, is a light bearer, and he's an intercessor between the inhabitants of Middle-earth, elves and men, and the godlike powers of the Valar. He also slays a giant dragon, an evil dragon. So in that way, he's a bit like St. Michael. So he has parallels to both St. Michael and John the Baptist. He's not a Christ figure. He's a herald. He's a messenger of a greater light. And he becomes a bearer of one of the Silmarils, so the great jewels made of light. And as he carries that light in his ship across the night sky, he becomes the morning star. At one point in the Silmarillion, he lands in Valinor, and he's greeted by a voice crying, "Hail, Earendel, of mariners most renowned, the looked for that cometh unawares, the longed for that cometh beyond hope. Hail, Earendel, bearer of light before the sun and moon, splendor of the children of earth, star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning." And Earendel's also mentioned several times in The Lord of the Rings. So he is an ancestor of several important characters. He's Elrond's father, and also the father of the first king of Númenor, which means that both Aragorn and Arwen are descended from him. When Bilbo is staying in Elrond's house at Rivendell, he sings a long poem about Earendel. And in Lothlorien, Galadriel gives Frodo a glass containing the light of Earendel's star. So at an especially dark moment on their quest, when Sam and Frodo are trapped in the lair of the monstrous spider Shelob, the light of Earendel comes to their aid. And it comes almost as a moment of divine revelation, kind of provided to them before they even know how to ask for it. So this is Sam. As he stood, darkness about him and a blackness of despair and anger in his heart, it seemed to him that he saw a light in his mind, almost unbearably bright at first, as a sun ray to the eyes of one long hidden in a windowless pit. So Sam reminds Frodo of the lady's, Galadriel's gift. And Frodo answers like one answering out of sleep, hardly comprehending. A light when all other lights go out, and now indeed light alone can help us. Slowly his hand went to his bosom, and slowly he held aloft the phial of Galadriel. For a moment it glimmered, faint as a rising star, struggling in heavy earthward mists. And then as its power waxed and hope grew in Frodo's mind, it began to burn and kindled to a silver flame, a minute heart of dazzling light, as though Earendel had himself come down from the high sunset paths with the last Silmaril upon his brow. The darkness receded from it until it seemed to shine in the centre of a globe of airy crystal, and the hand that held it sparkled with white fire. So Frodo himself is astonished at what's happening, and he cries out in Elvish, "Hail, Earendel, brightest of stars." And he knew not what he had spoken, for it seemed that another voice spoke through his, clear, untroubled by the foul air of the pit. So it's a very powerful moment, and it does contain another echo of that Anglo-Saxon poem in that "Hail, Earendel." And Frodo's kind of experience as he speaks these words, not quite knowing what he's saying, as if another voice is speaking through him, kind of recalls that strange, almost mystical effect that the Anglo-Saxon poem has in the Notion Club papers. These are words which are almost like a spell or a prayer. They have a power of their own, calling upon the powers of light in this moment of deep darkness. Okay, so to conclude, as the evening star, the light of Earendel is primarily associated with the cycle of night and day, of course, but the resonances which this name carries over from the Old English poems also link it to the yearly cycle of the solstices and equinoxes. It brings echoes of that poem for the night of the winter solstice and the connection with the new Earendel, John the Baptist, whose light appears as the year begins to wane on the day of the autumn equinox when Tolkien first wrote about Earendel. And across Tolkien's writings over the many decades in which he was developing his mythology, this moment of the equinox held a powerful significance. It is there in his story of the heavenly light bearer, Earendel, who blends these myths of Lucifer and the morning star with St. Michael and John the Baptist, Christian festivals very closely associated with the autumnal equinox. But it's also there in the story of the ring bearer, Frodo, setting out on his journey at the equinox to travel into the darkness, carrying this burden that has to be destroyed before light can return to the earth in spring. So these are very different kinds of journeys, but they begin at the same moment, at this moment, this time when the scales of the year tip towards the darkness. So Tolkien's myths perhaps offer us images of light, symbols of hope and courage that we can carry with us as we move on this journey into the darker months. Okay, so I think we can stop the recording at that point. And then